An EU summit was trying very hard to agree upon this. And obviously, this coalition of the willing, which makes up 20 countries that are largely EU countries, there are others like Canada and Australia involved, has sort of stepped up here to try and signal the commitment to do this, not now, in a while, to try and make up the difference here.
Britain and the European Union will agree a deal to use frozen Russian assets for Ukraine's defence by the end of the year. The commitment was made at the end of a meeting of the Coalition of the Willing, hosted by Keir Starmer in London. Speaking alongside President Zelensky, the Prime Minister insisted there will be no let-up for Russia.
Working with the US, this coalition is determined to go further than ever to ratchet up the pressure on Putin, from the battlefield to his war economy, because that is the only way to change his mind and push him back to the table.
Well, let's speak now to Nina Dos Santos, who's former Europe editor at CNN. Morning, Nina.
Good morning. Hi, Chloe.
So talk to us about the significance of this deal. We've been talking so long about whether the coalition of the willing would use these frozen Russian assets. What has actually been agreed?
Well, it's a little bit confusing, really, because there was an EU summit that took place earlier on this week where it appeared yet again some of those larger EU members were loath to actually do this, to unfreeze about 120 odd billion pounds that is sitting in an organisation called Euroclear, which is in Brussels, which they have managed to use the interest from some of these payments, but they don't want to actually take away all of those assets and then just hand them over to Ukraine to help Ukraine in its war endeavour, because there are some big nations like, for instance, Germany and Italy that are quite concerned that could set a pretty dangerous precedent for when it comes to encouraging people to invest in the EU at a time when obviously America's economy is doing very well. It's very strong. It's trying to convince everybody to invest in America. There's not a huge amount of investment that's forthcoming across the EU. So an EU summit was trying very hard to agree upon this. And obviously, this coalition of the willing, which makes up 20 countries that are largely EU countries, there are others like Canada and Australia involved, has sort of stepped up here to try and signal the commitment to do this, not now, in a while, to try and make up the difference here. Now, the difficulty for President Zelensky of Ukraine is that he's been on a whistle-stop tour from Washington to Brussels, and so this is the final stop in his tour, and the coalition of the willing is trying to show that they are at least willing to do what some other countries aren't.
Yeah, I guess, that deadline by December, you wonder, they're still sort of pushing it down the road, and you wonder if it will actually come to pass. We spoke yesterday on this programme to Nick Thomas-Symonds from the government, and he was saying it's an idea to use these frozen Russian assets, which is really being pushed by the UK. But the sense is there is still, as you point out, that reluctance amongst countries. So you wonder if it will come to fruition.
Yes, that's the big question. Obviously, there's, as I was saying before, a large amount of money that's inside this European system. And the one thing I suppose they are taking comfort from is that the United States has started heavily sanctioning, just in the last few days, Russian oil, two big Russian oil companies. And ironically enough, again, just going back to looking at Europe, it is actually the European Union that is the outlier on this at the moment, because countries like Hungary rely so heavily on Russian oil and gas from these two entities. So again, the point here is that the pressure is financial. It's not necessarily military. So if you look at it from Zelensky's point of view, he started out the last 7 days by heading over to Washington, D.C., hoping, and he believed that he had been encouraged to hope that the United States would eventually agree to sell his country very sophisticated long-range Tomahawk missiles. It appeared as though Donald Trump, the US president, was willing to do that. But when Zelensky arrived on US soil, the US president rode back from helping out with that type of military hardware. But what they did, on the other hand, though, is that they called off a supposed peace summit that was supposed to take place in in Budapest, between the leaders of Russia and the United States, and also the US started a sanction, what really makes Russia its money, and that is oil and gas. So the pressure here coming from the coalition of the willing, the talk of pressure coming from Brussels, and the pressure that we've seen from the United States has been financial. But really what President Zelensky has been after is these sophisticated US-made Tomahawk missiles. He hasn't managed to get them, but he has got other hardware like the Storm Shadow missiles that are French and UK made that made such a devastating impact on a Russian chemicals factory earlier on this week. So he's been able to show that if they are given the hardware, if they are given access to the hardware and also given the money to try and buy that hardware further down the line, that Ukraine can make quite some success on the battlefield, striking deep into Russian territory. So the money's coming now, but not yet the missiles.
You're talking there about that financial pressure, and many people we've spoken to over the last few days have talked about the potential significance of those sanctions against those Russian oil companies by President Trump. But you also mentioned there the fact that Hungary is one of several countries that are still buying Russian oil. What pressure is being applied by other EU nations on the likes of Hungary to stop it?
Well, obviously, Hungary has for a long time been the sort of awkward outlier democratically in terms of its rule of law. It's clashed with Brussels on all sorts of issues, not least, for instance, its support for Russia. Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, has made no secret alongside Robert Fico of Slovakia that they are a lot more pro-Putin than other EU countries. And those are the two countries that buy their oil and gas from these two big Russian players. So the EU, obviously, by virtue of the fact that it has to decide things by unanimity in most cases, or some cases, by consensus, overwhelming consensus in others, is in an awkward position here because there are lots of countries across the EU that have managed to wean themselves off oil and gas quite significantly, not least, of course, Germany, remember, that has been blamed for making the EU quite so reliant, and indeed the biggest economy inside the EU, quite so reliant on Russian oil and gas. Some countries have done quite a lot to scale back that appetite for that more cheaper oil and gas coming from Russia. But there are countries like Hungary and Slovakia that, for their own political reasons, don't want to do that and haven't been able to do that. So it's a much longer process to try and filter out this oil and gas from the EU markets, with Hungary and Slovakia being those outliers. But I think really the big issue, that the pressure that the United States has been able to leverage here, has been on big countries like India and China that have been buying huge amounts of cheap Russian oil and gas now that nobody else can buy it. And now just suddenly in the last 2 days, since those US sanctions on Russian oil and gas have finally come into play, we have seen India and China massively scale back their imports. And that's essentially what the US is looking for, not EU countries like Hungary and Slovakia.
Nina, good to speak to you. Thank you so much for coming on. That's Nina Santos, who's former Europe editor at CNN.